Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a truly monumental task. We're diving deep into Friedrich Nietzsche's 1887 masterpiece, the Genealogy, their moral on the genealogy of morality. And this is a highly specialized, fiercely argued text. It's provocative in a way that very few other philosophical works really manage to be.
It is indeed. And for you listening, we should probably warn you, this is not a gentle book. Nietzsche himself wrote that his works are not easily accessible. They require just a tremendous amount of intellectual effort. It's written in this aphoristic, almost explosive style. It demands that you weigh every single sentence very carefully. So our mission here is to take that immense density and, make it thoroughly understandable and critically engaging.
Yeah, because the moment you approach this text, you realize the stakes are just so much higher than in a typical ethical treatise. Nietzsche isn't just analyzing morality, he's questioning its very foundation. The radical, almost terrifying premise is this. What is the value of morality itself? Does it actually lead to human flourishing, or is it perhaps a sign of decay?
That is the core question, the one that drives all three of the essays within the genealogy. We, as inheritors of Western thought, we're trained to assume that good is just synonymous with progress, with utility, with survival. Nietzsche forces us to confront the possibility that this might be the grandest psychological error in history. What if morality is less a cure and more a sinister symptom of regression?
And before we plunge into the history, it really helps to understand his method. He's adamant that a philosopher's values, his yeses, nos, his judgments, they're never just sporadic or arbitrary.
No, they're necessitated. He believes they grow from a single, unified source, which he calls the Grundwillen der Erkenntnis, the commanding ground will of knowledge. So everything he concludes, no matter how shocking it sounds to us, is internally consistent. It all stems from this foundational, unifying will. He's not just giving us his opinion, he's presenting what he sees as the necessary conclusions of his will to knowledge.
So let's follow that intellectual journey. Nietzsche recalls that earlier in his life, he was wrestling with the classic theological problem of the origin of evil. He even admitted he tried to give God the credit for evil, searching for its source behind the world, but that approach, it just failed him.
Right. And the great intellectual pivot for him was realizing he couldn't use theology or metaphysics to solve a problem that was, at its heart, historical and psychological. He used his professional training as a philologist, as a historian, to rephrase the entire question. We shouldn't ask where evil came from, but rather under what historical and social conditions did man actually invent and impose the value judgments good and evil? How did these words get their power?
And this immediately brings us to the crux of it all, the value question.
Hmm.
We treat the value of good as this unquestionable axiom. It's just assumed to promote stability, utility, human prosperity. We never bother to look at the receipts, so to speak.
We've effectively placed morality beyond critique. But Nietzsche asks, what if that assumption is the most dangerous error? What if good, in its current interpretation, is actually a signal of decadence? He leads us to ponder if this morality prevents the emergence of something far grander, the höchste Mächtigkeit und Pracht, the highest powerfulness and magnificence of the human type. Could the comfort morality provides be paid for by stunting humanity's potential?
That is just a staggering hypothesis. And if morality is the danger of all dangers, then he has to identify the instinct that he finds most suspicious in modern culture. And that is pity or Mitleid.
Yes, and he directs a specific and very personal attack against Arthur Schopenhauer here. Schopenhauer, who was just immensely influential at the time, had essentially deified pity and selfless sacrifice. He placed them as values in themselves, the very expression of moral worth. Nietzsche argues that this philosophy of pity leads directly to a no-saying attitude toward life, or rejection of the will itself.
And this is where the critique really begins to bite, isn't it? He starts to express a fundamental suspicion toward this whole modern morality of pity. Why is it such a danger?
Because he sees it as the große Gefahr der Menschheit, the great danger to humanity. Pity is, psychologically, the quickest way to create the common herd mentality. It elevates the suffering of the weak to a moral imperative, and in doing so, it drags down the health, the vigor, and the will of the strong. It doesn't heal, it just perpetuates a generalized state of illness and spiritual fatigue.
So if the strong feel they have to constantly compensate for the weak, the standard for all human endeavor it necessarily drops.
Precisely. He labels the modern cult of Mitleid a sinister symptom of our sinister European culture, and he views it as a potential detour toward a great exhaustion, a new secular European nihilism, sort of echoing the passive resignation of Buddhism. This is where he brings in historical context to challenge our modern sensibility.
And that context is fascinating because modern pity, which we just take for granted as this universal good, is historically it's an anomaly.
It really is. Nietzsche points out that if you look at the giants of Western philosophy, Plato, Spinoza, the French moralists, La Rochefoucauld, and even Count Four Minds, who disagreed violently on pretty much everything else, they were absolutely united in their disdain for pity. They saw pity as a weakness, a disruptive passion, something to be overcome by reason. The modern elevation of pity is a very new, and in Nietzsche's view, highly dangerous deviation.
So what's the ultimate conclusion of this whole introductory critique? If morality might be a disease, then we have to stop treating good as some kind of divine revelation.
We need a critique of moral values. That's the demand. We must subject the value of morality to the same rigorous scrutiny we apply to scientific or historical facts. We need precise knowledge of the conditions and circumstances from which these values grew. Are they a mask for weakness, a symptom of physiological decline, a poison that stunts growth, or, perhaps a genuine cause for higher human expression?
And the final stake in the ground is that we have to determine if our current morality is leading to a more comfortable, safer, but ultimately smaller and lower type of man, a present that is living at the expense of the future. We have to find out if we're sacrificing a magnificent future type for the safe, calculable herd man of today. Okay, so to begin this genealogical search, Nietzsche immediately targets his contemporaries, the English moral psychologists like Paul Ray and Herbert Spencer, and he just dismisses their theory as superficial, lacking any genuine historical sensibility.
He calls their work unhistorische, Stumpfarbeit, unhistorical hack work. It's a brutal dismissal. Their theory was simple. First, good originated when people praised unselfish acts because they were useful to the person receiving them. This is the basic utilitarian premise.
Right. And second, that the origin of that usefulness was later forgotten. The acts became habitual, and people began to feel they were just inherently good, forgetting the pragmatic benefit that started it all.
Nietzsche's refutation is swift and purely psychological. I mean, how could utility, usefulness be forgotten? If an action is constantly beneficial, saving you time or money or effort, that utility is reinforced daily. It would be an unforgettable experience impressed upon your consciousness with ever greater clarity, not disappearing through habit. This leads him to his really revolutionary counter-thesis.
The inversion of origins. The judgment good did not come from those to whom goodness was shown, the beneficiaries, but from the people who had the power to make the judgment in the first place.
Exactly. It came from the good themselves, the noble, the powerful, the high-placed, the masters. This is the crucial distinction. The noble class defined what was good by affirming themselves.
And this is the concept he terms the pathos of nobility and distance. Can you elaborate on what that pathos really means?
It's the enduring, self-affirming sense of a higher ruling species in relation to a lower one.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental celebratory yes to their own life, their own power, their own vigor. The aristocratic man acts and grows spontaneously. He only needs the contrast, the bad, schlecht, to acknowledge what he is not. But the origin of the value is internal. It's an overflow of vitality.
So the original opposition isn't good and evil, it's good and bad, where bad just means common or lowly.
Precisely. And this is where he brings in his brilliant use of etymological evidence. If we look at language, the common thread across Indo-European languages shows that noble or well-born is the fundamental concept from which good develops.
Yeah, and we have these concrete examples that really make it stick. Take Greek. Eslos originally meant the one who is real, who has reality, who is true. That was the aristocratic term. And it stood in contrast to the common man, who was often considered, inherently dishonest or lying.
Or look at German. The word schlecht, bad, was originally schlicht, simple or plain. It referred to the common man, the average laborer. It only acquired its negative moral connotation after the aristocracy used it to mark their distance.
And Latin with bonus. It possibly derives from duonis, meaning the warrior or man of strife. In ancient Rome, what made a man good was his military and civic capacity, his strength in conflict.
The linguistic history proves, for Nietzsche, that the initial moral valuation was rooted in social status, physical capacity, biological vigor, not altruism. The whole concept of selfish versus unselfish only emerges and becomes dominant much later upon the decline of aristocratic values when the herd instinct finally finds its voice and demands equality.
Now, this aristocratic model undergoes a really dangerous transformation when the highest caste shifts from the noble warrior to the priestly class.
This is the crucial stage where morality starts to become poisonous. When the ruling caste is priestly, the opposition shifts from good-bad to pure unclean. And importantly, these are initially very crude external concepts. Washing rituals, avoiding certain meats that cause disease, avoiding blood, or avoiding commoners.
But because the priestly caste is denied that outlet of physical, immediate action, they can't just conquer or fight or dominate through physical might, their valuation starts to internalize and become spiritualized.
And that is why, Nietzsche argues, priests are the most evil enemies. They are the most powerless.
Right.
And because of that, their hatred grows into something immense, spiritual, uncanny, and fundamentally poisonous. They are the greatest, most ingenious haters in human history because their hatred can't be discharged physically. It has to be intellectualized into a whole worldview.
And this intellectualized hatred is the psychological precondition for the slave revolt in morality.
Yes, the single greatest turning point in the history of values. It is the moment when ressentiment becomes creative and actually gives birth to an entire system of values.
We have to define ressentiment clearly for you. It's more than just resentment, isn't it?
Oh, much more. It's the deep-seated psychological reaction of those who are denied the proper, immediate reaction of action. The slaves, the powerless, the victims, they can't strike back physically, so they compensate via an imaginary spiritual revenge. Noble morality is a spontaneous affirmation. I am good, therefore what is not me is bad. Slave morality, born of ressentiment, starts with a categorical no to the external world, to the masters, to the not-self. That negative reaction is its creative act.
So they look at the masters, the strong, healthy, vigorous nobles, and they redefine them through the poisoned eye of ressentiment as the evil one, Durbos.
Precisely. And once they have successfully labeled the powerful as evil, they define themselves in a necessary reciprocal contrast as the good, the miserable, the poor, the meek, the humble, the pious. Strength becomes a vice. Weakness becomes a virtue. This is the fundamental inversion of values.
And this struggle is historically encapsulated in the conflict between Rome and Judea.
Yes, Rome represents the strong, noble, classical ideal. Unapologetically mighty, leaving their monuments everywhere in both their glorious deeds and their cruel excesses. They judged on capacity and power. Judea, the priestly people, is the people of Ressentiment par excellence, possessing this unparalleled popular moral genius for effecting this inversion of values on a global scale.
And according to Nietzsche, the slave ideal won this 2,000-year war. The victory is complete.
The evidence is all around us, he argues. Consider before whom the world bows today, wherever man has been tamed, before 3 Jews and 1 Jewish Jesus of Nazareth, the fisherman Peter, the tent-maker Paul, and Mary. This triumph of Judea over Rome, the spiritual triumph of the weak over the physically mighty, is the undeniable victory of the slave ideal, leading to the gradual plebeianization and Christianization of everything.
Is there any counterpoint to this? Any resistance to this triumph that Nietzsche recognizes?
There was one brief, magnificent flash of the classical ideal reasserting itself. The figure of Napoleon Bonaparte. Nietzsche saw Napoleon as the last great symbol, a terrifying synthesis of the inhuman, the wild, noble beast of conquest, and the superhuman, Übermensch. He offered a momentary, frightful glimpse of the opposite, life-affirming ideal before the ressentiment machine, powered by democracy and mass pity, reasserted its dominance.
Okay, moving to the second treatise, we tackle the origins of guilt, conscience, and punishment. Nietzsche starts not with sin, but with evolution. He defines humanity's earliest, most difficult task.
The immense prehistorical, pre-moral task of nature was to breed an animal that is allowed to promise. Just think about the complexity of that. This required making man predictable, uniform, regular, and necessary. The greatest work of human history, the foundation of civilization, was the Sittlichkeit der Sitte, the morality of custom. This collective tyrannical system, achieved through long periods of hardness and conformity, successfully made man calculable to his peers.
This sounds absolutely brutal. It requires complete social conformity to just stamp out spontaneity.
It was brutal. It was a tyranny of custom. But from this crushing homogenization, the final ripened fruit eventually emerged, the sovereign individual. This individual is autonomous, free from the morality of custom, because he has internalized its commands so thoroughly. He can guarantee himself into the future because he knows he can keep his word regardless of changing circumstances.
And this individual's defining trait is his conscience.
Yes, but not the bad conscience that we think of today. This is the joyful, proud knowledge of his privilege, his inner self-mastery. His conscience is a joyful affirmation of his mastery over circumstances and fate. He is the master of his free will.
But how did primitive society manage to create memory in this naturally forgetful animal? Because forgetfulness, he argues, is actually a necessary defense mechanism.
Forgetfulness is the gatekeeper of the soul. It prevents us from being overwhelmed by constant sensory noise. To overcome this, primitive society relied on the mnemotechnics of pain. The fundamental axiom was, only that which does not cease to hurt stays in memory.
We have to pause here and really realize the horror this implies for prehistory.
It necessitated terrible means: blood, torture, sacrifices, and the cruelest rituals. The gruesome practices like self-mutilation or blood-stained religious ceremonies, at their base they are systems of cruelty designed to etch fixed ideas into the nervous system through intensive suffering. Our present-day seriousness, our gravity, our noble things are built upon this terrifying foundation of ancient blood and horror, designed simply to make us remember our promises and our contracts.
And this leads us to the crucial genealogical breakthrough, the origin of guilt. He refutes the modern notion that guilt is somehow innate or linked to free will.
Right. Guilt, Schuld, originates not from sin, but from the extremely material, primitive concept of debt, Schulden, in the ancient contractual relationship between a creditor and a debtor. This is a cold commercial transaction, not a moral one. This relationship, rooted in basic trading and borrowing, is perhaps the oldest legal relationship on Earth.
And the core principle of this transaction is the equivalence of damage and pain.
Absolutely essential. The idea is so deeply rooted in human history.
Mm.
If the debtor cannot pay the debt materially, the creditor is compensated by giving the creditor schmerz, suffering, in exchange for the damage. It's a mathematical equation where suffering is equivalent to financial loss.
But the key psychological element here is the creditor's pleasure.
Yes. When the debtor failed, the creditor was compensated not just by the cancellation of the debt, but with a specific, powerful Wohlgefühl, a good feeling. This was the pleasure of inflicting cruelty and enjoying the sense of power over the powerless. This structured cruelty was highly valued at eduius utendi, the right to use the debtor for satisfaction, and legal history confirms this, with procedures that allowed the creditor to carve off proportional flesh or even enslave the debtor.
So punishment, which echoes this original contract, is inherently festive.
It is. Seeing suffering feels good. Inflicting suffering feels better. And Nietzsche notes that this wasn't just barbaric, it was formalized. Until quite recently, princely weddings or great folk festivals were unthinkable without the spectacle of executions, public tortures, or auto-da-fés. The social joy of watching the suffering of the punished, the one who broke the social contract, was part of the ritual.
It's necessary here to distinguish between the origin of punishment and its purpose. For a long time, punishment had nothing to do with morality or guilt.
Correct. For the longest time, the criminal was seen as an irresponsible piece of fate, or a source of damage that needed to be neutralized or repaid. Punishment developed independently of any idea of free will. Its purposes were highly fluid: neutralization, repayment, Abzolung, terror, isolation, a memorial, or war against an enemy. These purposes are accidental additions imposed upon the original procedure of inflicting pain for pleasure.
And what was the actual psychological effect of this external, painful punishment on the criminal?
Well, it certainly did not create bad conscience or a sense of sin. Instead, punishment hardens and chills the soul. It concentrates and strengthens resistance. The criminal sees his deed as something that unforeseenly went wrong, and it just increases his cunning and fear to avoid getting caught next time. The external punishment merely teaches prudence, not morality.
So if punishment doesn't create guilt, then where does the terrifying bad conscience, the hallmark of modern man, where does it come from?
This is the pivotal evolutionary shift. Man found himself suddenly enclosed within the crushing machinery of the state. The state, in its oldest form, was established by a conqueror race, the blonde beasts, ruthlessly organized for war and organization. This was a sudden, violent transition.
And what happened to the wild, free man inside this new, structured environment?
All his powerful predatory instincts, hostility, cruelty, the desire for pursuit, adventure, they could no longer discharge externally. They were violently suppressed by the iron cage of the state's law. They had to turn inward against the human himself. This is the Verinnerlichen, the internalization of man.
The analogy is so stark. The wild animal, trapped in a cage, unable to strike out, turns on itself, biting and tearing itself apart.
Exactly. The inner world, what we call the soul, expands, gains depth, breadth, and complexity precisely because the instincts for freedom and external conflict are violently suppressed and turned inward. This self-torture, this violently suppressed instinct for freedom turning against its owner, that is the origin of the bad conscience. The savage man, confined by peace and custom, becomes the inventor of inner psychological self-torture.
And this internalization of debt reaches its absolute maximum zenith when this debt is owed not merely to the tribe or the ancestors, but to the progressively growing maximal concept of the Christian God.
The growth of the God concept correlates directly with the maximal growth of guilt on earth. The Christian God, being infinitely holy and capable of infinite sacrifice, necessarily makes human debt, sin, infinite and unpayable. The concept of sin is simply the priest's reinterpretation of this psychological, animalistic bad conscience, allowing man to tortuously interpret his deepest, inescapable animal instincts as guilt against God.
So we see the connection. The slave revolt redefined good and evil, the state created the conditions for the bad conscience, and then the priest provided the maximum interpretive framework for that bad conscience. This brings us to the final and most paradoxical inquiry: the ascetic ideal. Why would humanity embrace poverty, chastity, and self-denial? Why this ultimate will against life?
The deepest explanation is rooted in a psychological necessity, a fundamental human drive. Man needs a goal, zeal. He suffers not primarily from the pain of life, which is constant, but from the horror vacui, the fear of emptiness, the fear of meaninglessness. Man would rather will the nothing than not will at all.
So the ascetic ideal is born out of a desperate fundamental drive to impose a meaning, any meaning, onto chaos and suffering.
Correct. The ideal of chastity, poverty, and self-denial expresses this necessity. It is a profound, if pathological, manifestation of the human will. It gives direction, even if that direction is against the biological flourishing of man.
We have to, however, distinguish between the different users of asceticism. The source provides some critical context for the philosopher's adoption of this lifestyle.
Philosophers throughout history, Heraclitus, Plato, Kant, Schopenhauer, they adopt the external form of asceticism: solitude, freedom from disturbance, a rejection of marriage and duties. Crucially, they do this not for moral piety, but because it provides the optimal conditions for their dominant instinct. Their will to knowledge, their will to maximal power in thought, requires the removal of distraction.
It's a means to an end, a necessary discipline for intellectual rigor.
And historically, it was a disguise. The philosophical spirit, the spirit of free inquiry, had to verkleiden und verpuppen, disguise and pupate, itself as the priest, the prophet, or the religious man to even be possible in its earliest, most dangerous stages. The ascetic ideal was the philosopher's necessary prerequisite for public existence.
But the central figure of this treatise is not the philosopher, it's the ascetic priest. What is his true historical function in Nietzsche's view?
He is the preordained savior, shepherd, and lawyer of the sick herd. His entire domain is the mastery over sufferers. To master the sick, he must himself be sick, or at least intimately familiar with the psychology of suffering. He is the adversary of all raw, stormy, unrestrained, tough, violent, predatory health.
So he's fighting against a societal epidemic.
Yes. The priest is battling the problem of malaise, unless to feel, a widespread depression, heaviness, and physiological inhibition that was common among the herd in Europe. This general feeling of worthlessness and fatigue can stem from many causes: the mixing of dissimilar races, poor adaptation to changing climates, or just the exhaustion inherent in the constant domestication of man. The great religions are fundamentally systematic campaigns against an epidemic of collective fatigue and heavy spirits.
The priest, therefore, needs a medicine, a psychological treasure house of cleverest consolation to relieve this pervasive suffering. We should probably detail these tools. Let's start with the first one: hypnotism or dampening.
This is about reducing the feeling of life to its lowest possible point, effectively achieving a state of deep physiological rest. The goal is nirvana, a deep sleep where metabolism is minimal and consciousness is barely present. This is achieved through fasting, non-desiring, non-loving, and the intentional dulling of the intellect, what Pascal advised as il faut s'abatir, one must become stupid. The pain is minimized by minimizing life itself.
The second tool is mechanical activity.
And this is just the use of sheer distraction. The intentional diverting of attention from suffering through unquestioning obedience, self-forgetting rigid routines, and importantly, regular work, what is often called the blessing of work. The priest understood that consciousness is a narrow room. If you fill it with constant repetitive doing, there is very little room left for chronic sorrow or deep-seated existential suffering.
And this must be where the third tool, ordering the smallest joy, comes in.
Precisely. This means prescribing small, achievable, and easily repeatable pleasures that are often tied into that mechanical activity. This includes organizing structured groups for mutual support and emotional discharge, like the early Christian burial societies. These structures help the sick herd find relief and structure within their shared suffering, making life slightly more bearable and thus warding off total nihilism.
But the fourth tool is the most psychologically complex and ultimately the most dangerous: emotional excess.
Yes, this is the use of strong, acute affects, anger, revenge, hope, despair, to shock the soul out of its slow, chronic suffering. The priest needs to replace a dull, generalized depression with intense, highly interesting anguish. To do this, he must create a necessary enemy, the sinner.
So how does the priest use the psychological weapon to create the sinner?
He gives the suffering man the first cause for his suffering. The sick man, who is already thinking, I am suffering, someone must be to blame, is directed by the priest to look within himself toward a guilt clearly has accumulated against the maximal God.
The psychological shift there is profound.
The old, generalized, boring depression is overcome. Life suddenly becomes intensely interesting, characterized by anguish, self-flagellation, and a desperate cry for redemption. This spiritual intoxication gives the priest total power. The suffering man now wills his pain, believing it serves some higher purpose. He has meaning.
But the result is tragically ironic. While the priest cured the malaise, he made man infinitely sicker.
The systematic application of this penitential anguish, this moralized self-torture, made the sick man better in terms of tameness and obedience, but psychologically and physiologically, he was ruined. Nietzsche cites historical evidence. This cure led to vast ruined nervous systems and vast waves of spiritual contagion, like the epileptic epidemics that swept parts of Europe. This ideal is named as the actual verhangness, calamity in the health history of European man.
Okay, we've traced the genealogy from the aristocratic valuation of good to the ressentiment-driven invention of evil, through the state suppression that created the bad conscience, and finally to the priest's management of suffering via the ascetic ideal. Now, we have to turn to the end of that ideal. Nietzsche argues that Christian morality contains the seeds of its own destruction through the principle of truthfulness.
That is the ultimate paradox. The rigorous demand for honesty and truthfulness, which Christianity itself sublimated into the modern scientific conscience, eventually turns its weapon against the Christian dogma itself. The claim that everything in nature and history confirms the goodness of God is now seen by intellectually honest consciences as indecent, dishonest, and cowardly. Christianity collapses under its own internal demand for radical honesty.
But once the belief in the Christian God is denied, the world is left with a new, formidable problem for us knowers. What is the value of truth itself? Why do we feel compelled to cling to it?
The will to truth demands its own critique. We have questioned the value of morality, but we haven't questioned the worth of truth, which has always been taken as absolute. Nietzsche suggests that the unconditional belief in the idea of truth is merely the secularized, aesthetic manifestation of the God ideal. If we deny the otherworldly God, we must logically question the idea of an otherworldly, unquestionable truth.
And this leads to the surprising connection between the ascetic ideal and modern science. Science, to the modern ear, sounds like the polar opposite of self-denial, but Nietzsche argues it's its most modern manifestation.
Science inherits the essential ascetic virtues: rigor, intellectual cleanliness, the will to live without comfortable illusions, and the belief in the uncriticizability of truth. For many scholars, their tireless, devoted, self-sacrificing work is not pure devotion to objective truth, but a means of Selbstbetäubung, self-sedation.
Science becomes a refuge.
It's a hiding place for disillusionment and the bad conscience, allowing the scholar to avoid seeing the deeper paradoxes of life, the meaninglessness of suffering, or perhaps something about themselves. They channel their ascetic discipline into tireless, specialized research instead of self-flagellation.
If science is just the latest version of the ascetic ideal, what then is the true antagonist?
The only thing fundamentally opposed to the ascetic ideal is art. Art is the realm in which lying is sanctified, where the will to deception is coupled with the good conscience. Art affirms the beautiful illusion, the appearance, the creative untruth, everything the ascetic ideal hates. The philosopher Plato instinctively recognized this danger and positioned himself as the greatest enemy of art because he knew its power to affirm the illusory world.
So we return then to the primal problem of man that the ascetic ideal temporarily solved.
Right. Man suffered not from suffering itself, but from the lack of a goal, the meaninglessness of suffering. The question, wozu Mensch überhaupt? To what purpose man, anyway? Was unanswered. The ascetic ideal functioned by interpreting suffering through guilt, giving man a sense and a direction.
And this final conclusion is the most provocative statement of the entire work.
The ascetic ideal is undoubtedly a hatred of life, a rebellion against its fundamental conditions, a will to nothingness. But it remains a will. And the profound, frightened conclusion is that man would rather will the nothing than not will at all. He needs the interpretation. He needs the goal.
So what does this all mean? We have successfully traced morality back from its supposed selfless, sacred origins to primitive commercial contracts, to debt, and to the deep-seated animalistic joy of inflicting pain. We've seen the ingenious yet pathological invention of the bad conscience as the necessary internal escape valve for wild instincts trapped by the state. And this culminates in the ascetic ideal, a complex psychological machine that gives meaning to suffering, thus saving man from absolute nihilism, but ultimately directing his will toward nothingness.
The genealogical journey has been from the aristocratic man of affirmation to the priestly man of ressentiment and the enslaved man of guilt. The core struggle of history, the conflict between Rome, the master ideal, and Judea, the slave ressentiment ideal, is laid bare. The victory of Judea led to the domestication of humanity, the increase of safety and comfort, and the establishment of a herd mentality, constantly deferring potential magnificence for guaranteed mediocrity.
The final provocative thought, then, must be about the future. We saw that brief, frightening glimpse of the classical ideal reawakening in Napoleon, a synthesis of the inhuman and superhuman. That suggests an alternative path to the path of fatigue and pity. Is the victory of the slave ideal leading inexorably to the decline and exhaustion of Europe? Is it final?
That question remains unresolved. Is the current state of modern European culture, this generalized fatigue, this great disgust, and the proliferation of pity, truly leading to ultimate nihilism, the cessation of will entirely? Or will the realization that the will to truth is itself a moral, ascetic imperative finally force a complete revaluation of all values? The ultimate self-overcoming of man, the creation of the Übermensch, the individual who surpasses the boundaries of conventional morality and wills life, not nothingness, that is the philosophical possibility. But which path the will chooses remains the most crucial problem for the coming centuries.